The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and asphalt, a familiar blend that clung to city streets at dusk. Neon signs flickered along the road, their hazy glow reflecting off rain-slick pavement. I had just stepped out of my car, stretching my shoulders after a long day, when I spotted them. Two men standing too stiffly near the entrance of a rundown building. Something about them immediately felt off. I've been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when someone is trying too hard to look authoritative. Their clothes were the first red flag. Cheap, ill-fitting suits that screamed more pawnshop special than government issue. One of them wore aviators, even though the sun had already dipped below the horizon. The other adjusted a badge on his belt. Too shiny, too perfect, like it had never been used for anything other than intimidation. I kept my expression neutral, but inside, my instincts were already firing off alarms. They stood with their feet planted wide, hands on their hips, trying to project dominance. But real authority doesn't need to be forced. It just exists. I had seen enough con artists and wannabe tough guys to know these two weren't who they pretended to be. As I approached, the taller one turned his head sharply, as if he'd been watching me the entire time. "Sir, this is a restricted area," he said. His voice clipped, authoritative, but not quite right. He didn't have the natural ease of someone who truly belonged in a position of power. I raised an eyebrow. Restricted? Since when? A slow grin crept across his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. Since we said so, I could feel it now, the tension in the air, the silent challenge hanging between us. They were expecting me to back down, to nod, apologize, and walk away like every other person they had intimidated before. Too bad for them. I wasn't just anybody, and they had no idea who they were dealing with. I've learned to trust my instincts. They've saved my skin more times than I can count, and right now, those instincts were screaming. Something about these guys wasn't adding up. The taller one, the self-appointed spokesman, stood too rigid, as if he were holding in a breath. His partner kept shifting his weight from foot to foot, fingers twitching like he wanted to reach for something. A weapon, maybe, or a radio that didn't exist. Real officers, real agents, didn't act like this. They carried their authority effortlessly, with a quiet confidence. These guys? They were trying too hard. Still, I played along, tilting my head slightly, as if considering their words. Restricted, huh? I repeated, glancing around. Funny, I don't see any signs. No barriers. Nothing to indicate this is off limits to the public. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps out the channel. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. The shorter one stiffened. The taller one recovered quicker. That's because this is an active investigation, he said smoothly. You need to leave the area immediately. An active investigation. Now that was interesting. I crossed my arms, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. Which department are you with? I asked. That was when I saw it, the flicker of hesitation. So quick most people wouldn't have caught it. The taller one's jaw tensed. His partner's eyes darted to the side, then back to me. The pause lasted less than a second, but it was enough. I had them. That's classified, the taller one finally said, his voice clipped. I almost smiled. Rookie mistake. Real agents don't answer like that. If they were legitimate, they'd flash credentials, state their agency, and give a brief but convincing explanation. Instead, these two were relying on vagueness and intimidation, hoping I'd just accept it and walk away. Too bad for them. I don't intimidate easily. I decided to push a little further. All right, I said, nodding slowly. If it's classified, then I assume your superior has the clearance to verify that? I reached into my jacket, pulling out my phone. I've got a few contacts who could clear this up in about 30 seconds. That's when things shifted. The shorter one took half a step forward. His experience has taught me one simple truth. When something doesn't feel right, it usually isn't. And right now, every instinct I had was telling me that these two weren't who they claimed to be. The taller one had the confidence, or at least he was trying to project it. He stood with squared shoulders, feet planted apart, hands casually resting on his hips, but something about it felt rehearsed, like he had studied authority rather than lived it. Real agents, real officers, carried a certain ease. The kind that comes from knowing you belong. These guys, they were performing. The shorter one was worse. He was fidgety, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes scanning the area like he expected something, or someone, to interrupt. His hand kept ghosting toward his hip, but there was no visible holster, no standard-issue radio. I could practically feel the nervous energy rolling off him. I gave them both another once-over, this time letting my mind dissect the smaller details. Their suits were mismatched, not just in color but in quality. The taller guy's was a little too crisp, the fabric too stiff, like it had been bought for the occasion rather than worn daily. The shorter one's jacket was slightly oversized, the sleeves just a touch too long. Their shoes didn't match either. The taller one wore polished black dress shoes, the kind that screamed trying too hard, while his partner had on scuffed brown loafers, not exactly standard government attire. Then there was the badge. It was clipped to the taller one's belt, positioned just so, making sure I'd see it. But when I glanced at it again, I noticed something was off. The emblem looked official at first glance, but the metal had an unnatural shine, like it had never been used, never been pulled out for a real ID check. The text on it was just a little too generic, lacking the depth and security features a real badge would have. I didn't let my face betray my thoughts. Instead, I tilted my head slightly, pretending to consider their words. "Restricted area, huh?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "That's interesting." The shorter one tensed. The taller one, the apparent leader, gave me a practiced smirk. "Yes, sir. This area is under investigation. We're going to have to ask you to leave." I crossed my arms. "Which agency are you with?" "That?" Hesitation. It was barely a second long, but it was there. The taller guy's jaw clenched, just briefly, and his partner's eyes darted to him like he was waiting for direction. "Inquiries like that go through the proper channels," he said smoothly. I almost smiled. That wasn't an answer, and we both knew it. A real agent would have identified himself immediately, flash the badge, state the agency, give a brief but convincing reason, and move on. These two? They were stalling. I decided to press a little further. "No problem," I said casually, reaching into my jacket. "I've got a few contacts who could verify that in about 30 seconds. The moment my hand moved, I saw it, the first crack in their performance. The shorter guy stiffened, and for a split second his hand twitched toward his jacket, like he was ready to reach for something. A gun? A radio? I wasn't sure yet, but I knew one thing. They weren't expecting me to push back. That's when I realized something else. They weren't just pretending to be in charge, they were afraid of being exposed. And that meant they had something to hide. The air between us thickened, charged with something just short of hostility. The taller guy squared his shoulders, his smirk fading into something colder. His partner, the jittery one, kept glancing around like he was waiting for someone to back him up, or maybe for an escape route. I had seen this play before, the shift from fake authority to forced intimidation. It was a predictable pattern, a bluff designed to make people second-guess themselves. Most folks, when faced with a firm voice and a badge, real or not, would cave. They'd apologize, step back, and let these guys walk all over them. Too bad I wasn't most people. "Sir," the taller man said, his voice now clipped. No trace of the false charm he had been wearing earlier. "You're interfering with an active federal investigation. If you don't leave immediately, we will have no choice but to detain you for obstruction." Obstruction? That was rich. I let the word hang in the air between us, watching them closely. The shorter man adjusted his jacket, his fingers twitching near his hip again. He wanted to be intimidating, but I could see the slight tremor in his hands. This was an act, and a bad one at that. "Obstruction?" I repeated, tilting my head slightly as if considering the accusation. "That's a serious charge." The taller man nodded, his confidence inflating now that he thought I was falling for it. "It is. We don't want to escalate this, but if you continue to interfere, we will be forced to take action." I almost laughed. Take action? Against me? I glanced around. A few bystanders were watching now, keeping their distance, but clearly intrigued. That's the thing about authority, real or fake. It draws attention. People naturally assume men who speak with confidence and throw around legal jargon Must know what they're talking about. And these two were banking on that, all right? I said, keeping my voice calm. Since this is a federal matter, I assume you have jurisdiction here? The shorter man swallowed hard. The taller one hesitated just a second too long before nodding. Of course. I raised an eyebrow. Interesting. Because last time I checked, jurisdictional authority isn't something you just claim. You'd have to coordinate with local law enforcement first. I assume the precinct knows you're here? Silence. The taller man's jaw tightened. That information is classified. I smirked. Right. Classified. That was it. That was the moment I saw the crack widen. They weren't expecting pushback. They were expecting me to get flustered, to back down. But I wasn't backing down. Then the shorter one snapped. "We don't have to explain anything to you," he barked, his face flushing. "You need to leave. Now." The outburst was a mistake. Losing control meant losing credibility. Real agents, real officers don't lose their tempers over simple questions. I could feel the tension spiking, the bystanders shifting uneasily. The taller man stepped in, trying to salvage the situation. "Look," he said, lowering his voice as if he were offering me a way out. "I get it. You're just a concerned citizen. But this isn't your business. Walk away before this gets worse." Before this gets worse? That sounded like a threat. I held his gaze, letting the moment stretch, letting him feel the weight of his words. Then slowly, deliberately, I reached into my jacket. Not fast, not threatening. Just enough to make them wonder. Just enough to shift the power dynamic. "Tell you." "What?" I said, voice even, controlled. "Since you two seem to be the authority here, let's clear this up. How about we all call this in?" The shorter man took a step back. The taller one's mask slipped for just a second. His eyes flickered to my hand, to my jacket. He was nervous. That was all I needed to know. They weren't just faking authority. They were afraid of being exposed. I could have shut them down right then and there. Could have pulled out my real badge, made a call, and watched their whole act crumble in seconds. But where's the fun in that? Instead, I decided to play along. Give them a little rope and see if they'd hang themselves. I took a small step back, raising my hand slightly, as if I were finally buying into their bluff. All right, I said, keeping my tone just hesitant enough. I didn't mean to interfere. Just seemed strange, that's all. The taller guy relaxed a fraction, his shoulders losing some of their stiffness. He thought he had me. Thought I was just another civilian getting spooked by authority. Perfect. I shoved my hands into my pockets, giving them both a once-over. "So, what exactly is this investigation about?" I asked, my voice just curious enough to seem harmless. The shorter guy, still jumpy, opened his mouth, but the taller one cut him off. "That information isn't public," he said smoothly. I nodded. "Got it. But just out of curiosity, federal, state, or local jurisdiction?" Another hesitation. Another crack. Real agents don't stumble over simple questions like that. The taller man straightened his tie. "Federal," he said quickly. Too quickly. I hummed. "Which agency?" The shorter guy's jaw tightened. "That doesn't concern you," he snapped. I held back a smirk. They were getting defensive? Good. That meant they were feeling the pressure. "Fair enough," I said, as if I were letting it go. "I just figured it must be serious. You know, shutting down a public area without local police presence? That's a bold move." I watched them carefully. The shorter guy shifted on his feet, his discomfort practically radiating off him. The taller man, though, was still trying to play it cool. "We have full authority to conduct this operation," he said. I frowned slightly, pretending to be deep in thought. "Huh? That's interesting." He narrowed his eyes. "What is?" I shrugged. "Well, I've seen a lot of joint operations before, and there's always a protocol. Local law enforcement gets notified first. Usually there's a press statement. But I checked my phone earlier. Nothing about an active investigation in this area." The shorter man's fingers twitched. The taller man's confidence wavered for just a second. I was getting to them. I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck like I was debating something. Then I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice. "Look, between us, I've got some contacts in federal agencies. If something big is going down here, I'd rather be on the right side of it." Maybe I can help? The taller man stiffened. We don't need help. Right, I said, nodding slowly. Of course. It's just that if this really is federal business, I'd assume you'd be working with actual field agents. The shorter guy's head snapped up, eyes darting to mine. The taller man's expression hardened. I let the words settle. Let them. Realized that I wasn't some random bystander, that I knew exactly what I was doing. The tension between us shifted. They weren't just annoyed now. They were worried. Good, because they had no idea what was coming next. There's a certain satisfaction in watching liars crumble. It's a slow, delicious process. First, the confidence wavers, then the cracks spread, and finally, the whole facade collapses in on itself. And these guys were just about at their breaking point. The taller one was still trying to act like he had the upper hand. His arms crossed over his chest, his stance wide. He had bought into his own performance so much that he couldn't see how fast he was losing control. His partner, though, the shorter one was already unraveling. He kept shifting his weight, hands fidgeting near his pockets like he was deciding whether to run or double down on the bluff. I let the silence hang between us a little longer, letting them think they still had control. Then, with an easy, almost lazy motion, I pulled back my jacket, just enough for them to see the badge clipped to my belt. And just like that, the game was over. The taller guy's eyes flickered down to the badge, and for the first time, I saw something real in his expression. Panic. It was brief, barely a second, but I caught it. The shorter guy reacted even worse. His entire body went stiff, and I swear I could hear the sharp inhale of breath as his brain scrambled for a way out. Shit, he muttered under his breath. The taller one wasn't ready to let go of the act just yet. What is this? He demanded, though his voice wasn't as strong as before. Who the hell are you? I gave them both a slow, knowing smirk and pulled my badge fully into view. Special Agent Daniel Carter, Federal Task Force, I said, my voice calm, controlled. And you two just made a very, very big mistake. The shorter man cursed again, his eyes darting toward the street, probably calculating his odds of making a run for it. Spoiler alert, they weren't good. The taller guy was still clinging to denial. That's fake, he spat, his voice edging on desperation. You're bluffing. I chuckled. Oh, I'm bluffing. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my ID, flipping it open for them to see. Go ahead, take a good look. Call it in if you want. I'll wait. Neither of them moved. You see, I knew something was off from the second you opened your mouths. I continued, my voice slow and deliberate. Want to know where you screwed up? The shorter man swallowed hard, but the taller one stayed, silent. Fine. I'd spell it out for them. First, I said, ticking the point off on my fingers, your badges. Too clean. Too perfect. Real badges get worn, scratched up. Yours looked like they came out of a prop shop. I took a step closer, watching them tense. Second, your suits. I continued. One of you looks like you just bought yours yesterday, and the other looks like you borrowed it off a guy 3 inches taller. Real agents don't show up to an operation looking like they got dressed in the dark. The taller man clenched his jaw, but I wasn't done. Third, your story. I let out a short laugh. Federal jurisdiction, but no local coordination? That doesn't happen. You idiots didn't even have a proper cover story prepared. The moment I started asking real questions, you panicked. Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. The taller man's hands curled into fists. You have no idea what you're messing with, he hissed, the last shred of his bravado bleeding into a thinly veiled threat. I raised an eyebrow. That so? I took another step forward, closing the distance between us. The shorter guy flinched. Here's what I do know, I said, lowering my voice just enough to make them lean in. You're not law enforcement. You're not federal agents. And whatever game you're playing here? I let the weight of my words sink in. It's over. The shorter man snapped first. He turned sharply, ready to bolt. I was faster. Before he could take a step, I reached out and grabbed his wrist, twisting just enough to make him stumble. I murmured. Not so fast. The taller guy was breathing harder now, his fists clenched, his eyes darting between me and his partner. He knew they were done. The only question was he stupid enough to try something? I almost hoped he was. because I had a feeling this was only the beginning of their problems. The shorter guy struggled against my grip, but it was useless. He wasn't trained for this, just another amateur who thought wearing a fake badge and barking orders would be enough to fool people. The taller one still hadn't moved. He was breathing hard, his fists clenched, but he knew the moment he lunged, it'd be over in seconds. He wasn't going to win this fight, and he knew it. "All right," I said, tightening my grip just enough to make the shorter guy wince. "Let's have a real conversation now. Who are you working for?" The taller man scoffed. "You're making a mistake." I laughed. "That's funny. I was just about to say the same thing to you." No response. Typical. Guys like this always think silence is their best defense. I reached into the shorter guy's jacket, ignoring his weak protests, and pulled out what I suspected I'd find. A cheap, flimsy badge with a generic emblem. Definitely fake. But the real prize was in his pocket. A notepad. I flipped through it quickly, my eyes scanning the scribbled names and numbers. Some were crossed out, others underlined. This wasn't just a random scam. These guys had a system. I held the notepad up, giving the taller guy a pointed look. "What's this? A list of your victims?" His jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." I ignored him and kept flipping. Then I saw something that made my stomach turn. An address. Several, actually. And next to them, notes about their targets. Elderly couple, lives alone, no security system. Business owner, cash-heavy operation, intimidate. Single mother, threatened with child services. I exhaled slowly, the pieces clicking together. They weren't just pretending to be law enforcement. They were using that fake authority to extort people. "You've been running a protection racket," I said, my voice low and cold. "Knocking on doors, flashing fake badges, scaring people into paying you off. And let me guess, anyone who doesn't play along gets a little extra pressure?" The shorter guy's breathing grew ragged. He knew the game was up. But the taller guy, he just smiled. It wasn't the reaction I expected. "You think you've got it all figured out, don't you?" he said. That put me on edge. I studied his face, the way his posture had shifted. He wasn't scared anymore. He was waiting, and that's when I heard it, a car engine, low, steady, too close. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see a black sedan idling at the curb. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, but I didn't need to. Someone was watching. Someone who hadn't expected things to go sideways this fast. The taller man smirked. "You really think it's just us?" I felt the weight of my badge. At my hip, the familiar hum of adrenaline kicking in. This wasn't just some small-time con. There was more to this. More people involved, and I had just kicked a hornet's nest. I turned back to the taller guy and smiled. "You know what? I think I'd like to ask you a few more questions. Because something told me." This was far from over. The black sedan at the curb didn't move, but I could feel the weight of whoever was inside watching, assessing, deciding. The key. Taller guy's smirk hadn't faded, but I could see the tension in his jaw now. He thought he still had a way out. Thought he could talk his way through this. "You have no idea what you've stepped into," he muttered. I tightened my grip on the shorter guy's wrist. "Yeah? Enlighten me." The shorter guy wasn't even trying to act tough anymore. His breathing had gone shallow, his pulse hammering under my grip. He was waiting for his partner to get them out of this, but I could see it in his eyes. He already knew they were done. Then the taller guy made his move. It wasn't smart. He lunged, reaching for something inside his jacket. Maybe a weapon, maybe just a last-ditch effort to run. Either way, it didn't matter. I had him against the hood of a parked car before he could blink, his arm twisted behind his back. He let out a sharp grunt of pain as I pressed down, my knee pinning him in place. "Bad move," I muttered. The shorter guy started squirming, but I shot him a glare. "Don't," I warned. A second later, I heard the wail of sirens. Backup had arrived. The easy black sedan at the curb peeled away, its tires screeching against the pavement. Whoever was inside. They wanted no part of this mess now. 2 marked units pulled up fast, red and blue lights flashing. The real authorities had arrived. A uniformed officer stepped out, hand on his holster. "Agent Carter," he greeted me. "These the guys?" "Yeah," I said, yanking the taller man upright. "Fake feds running an extortion racket. Their little act is over." The officer didn't hesitate. "Get them in the car," he ordered his partner. The shorter guy didn't resist as they cuffed him, but the taller one, he still had something to say. "You think this ends with us?" he hissed as they dragged him toward the squad car. "You have no idea who you're messing with." I stepped closer, lowering my voice just enough for only him to hear. "Neither do you." His eyes flickered with uncertainty, but it was too late for him now. As the doors slammed shut behind them and the sirens blared again, I let out a slow breath. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot, but for now, justice had been served. As the squad cars disappeared down the street, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows against the buildings, I stood there for a moment, letting the night settle around me. The air still carried the remnants of tension, the echoes of a confrontation that could have gone very differently if I hadn't trusted my instincts. That was the part that stuck with me the most. How easy it is to be fooled by authority, especially when it looks the part. I thought about the names in that notepad: the elderly couple, the single mother, the business owners, ordinary people who had been manipulated and scared into submission simply because someone in a suit with a badge told them to comply. That's the real danger of people like them. They don't need weapons. Just confidence, a fake title, and the assumption that no one will question them. And most of the time, no one does. I turned my gaze to the spot where the black sedan had been. Where the unknown figure had watched from the shadows before vanishing into the night. This wasn't over. Whoever they were working for, they weren't finished. But neither was I. I ran a hand over my badge, feeling its weight, not just in my palm, but in what it represented. Real authority isn't about intimidation. It's about responsibility. It's about protecting people, not exploiting them. So here's the lesson. Always question authority. A real officer, a real agent will never be afraid to prove who they are. They'll have credentials, they'll follow protocol, and they'll never rely on fear alone to get what they want. If someone tries to pressure you, tries to use their position to force compliance without explanation, stop. Ask questions. Demand proof. Because the moment a person in power fears being questioned, that's the moment you know they shouldn't have power at all. I took one last look at the street before turning away, already knowing this wouldn't be the last time I'd deal with something like this. But next time, I'd be ready, and so should everyone else. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. Don't forget to tap the bell icon to stay updated, and let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? Your support means the world.